So this morning's message is based in a story that's familiar to everyone. It's from the Christian Gospel of Luke, and this is from the NRSV version, so it's a little bit worded a little differently. Now, as Jesus and the disciples went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha received him into her house. She also had a sister called Mary who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me alone to serve? Tell her then to help me." But Jesus answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her." Luke 10:38. David. So growing up as a little kid in Hypertia, we call it, in High Point, my twin sister and I used to play this game of imagination. It was our favorite game, and it was called simply Mary and Margaret. You be Mary and I'll be Margaret, one of us would say. And then that was, in the summer days that seemed to last forever, and it was just delicious. We would pretend then to be two grown-up women busying ourselves in our pretend house, which is typically our bedroom, cleaning and cooking and taking care of babies. Eventually, though, while one of us kept about her busyness, the other one would end up playing quietly, reading or coloring and just being very still. And the game was over, at least for that day. So it was in remembering this game, you be Mary, I'll be Margaret, that I recalled the story of Mary and Martha, which is probably where it came from for us. And even if your spiritual practices have set aside the Christian Bible, there are so many ancient stories contained within those pages that I think it's worth exploring the allegory of this story of Mary and Martha. I love to imagine how that day unfolded. Martha was busy in her real adult world, cooking and cleaning and taking care of babies. And then Mary, on the other hand, ventures down to the center of town, as she is known to do, down to where the people gathered to talk and gossip about what was going on in the city. Up walks Mary's and Martha's longtime friend, the Rabbi Yeshua, Jesus. And after a short conversation, Mary invites the rabbi and his 12 helpers to dinner. Excitedly, I imagine her running down the street ahead of the group to tell Martha, "Martha, Martha, Jesus is in town and I've invited him and his helpers to dinner with us. They're just down the street." Well, Martha, I imagine, looks at Mary like the way anyone who had, on the spur of the moment, invited 13 guests for dinner. Martha looks at her like, "Have you lost your ever-loving mind?" There she stands in her work clothes, her hair a mess, the house a wreck, and the dinner she had planned was just leftovers. So now their longtime friend and that handsome crew of workers that travel with him have just walked in the front door and they're expecting dinner. So immediately, Martha, the busy person, rushes down to the root cellar and grabs a sack of potatoes and maybe a string of leather breeches, I'll tell you what those are later, to boil over the fire. And as she dashes through the center room, she sees that Mary and the men have gathered around Jesus to hear the story that he's about to tell them. And then when she runs back through to get the good linen out of the closet, she sees that Mary is still sitting there. So for the next hour, this scene just repeats itself as Martha's running about, whipping up a feast for her guests and refilling their drinks and seeing to their needs, while Mary's sitting quietly listening to the rabbi. The story in Luke tells us Mary was distracted with much serving. The storyteller says that she was busy and occupied. It kind of reminds me of Thanksgiving, those long, hot, sweaty hours in the kitchen. And the closer things get to being done, the more tense the cook gets. Don't get in my way. So it's in this crescendo of cooking and serving that Martha decides she's had enough. Why should Mary sit with the men while she is cooking up a storm? And I imagine that dinner isn't the only thing steaming in the kitchen. So she goes and complains. But, as we are wont to do, she didn't go and complain to the person she was aggravated with. She went over her head to Jesus. Because if anybody can get Mary to help, it would be their friend. So I almost can hear her whine as she complains to him. Rabbi, don't you care that my sister has left me by myself to serve? Tell her to help me. But instead of turning to Mary, Jesus turns back to Martha. Martha, Martha. Almost here, Marcia, Marcia. Martha, Martha. And I can see in his face the compassion. You are anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion that cannot be taken away from her. So if you ask 100 people the meaning of this story, and if you were taught the meaning of this story, the majority would say that it's to teach us that we need to take time for contemplation. It's the one thing that is needful in Martha that Mary is taking the time to do. The insight she's gaining from this contemplation is the good portion that will never be taken away from her. And as a people, we practice open worship. We practice contemplation and silence and centering. So I'm sure that most of us would completely agree with that interpretation of this story. But I'm thinking that the storyteller in Luke has more in store for us in this story. The answer Jesus gives Martha is actually pretty loaded. First off, he acknowledges that Martha's worried, fretful, distressed, anxious. Not just about cooking for 15 people, which is, pretty stressful in and of itself, but about many things. Does that sound like anybody you know? I think we can all raise our hands. How many of us doesn't keep a list of worries going on in our heads 24/7? How many of us doesn't have a list of things to do that isn't as long as our hand, if not as long as our arm, if we wrote it all down? Some of us have to get up in the mornings with our families, and we have to get the kids ready and take them to school, work a full day, and then circle back to cooking and cleaning and taking care of babies before we drop into bed for a precious few hours of sleep before it starts all over again the next day. Some of us still reel from that memory. Other of us are kept occupied with an endless list of to-dos that never, if you think about it, get completely done. But doesn't our culture value productivity and reward hard work? You don't get a bonus at work for sitting quietly and reflecting. You get a bonus for doing. The Puritan work ethic has been the American mantra and model of success for centuries. Keep your nose to the grindstone, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and keep going. Martha's endless activity has been denounced based on that interpretation, and yet our society demands that we be just like her. Don't just sit there, do something. And I say, don't just do something, sit there. So in response to Martha's distress, Jesus tells her one thing is needful. He doesn't say one thing is needed or one more thing is needed. He says there is one thing full of need. I don't think that the storyteller is telling us that service is not important. If it hadn't been for Martha's hard work, no one would have eaten. And putting our gifts and talents to use in the world, well, that's how we live out our witness and our faith. But in Martha's need for a perfect banquet, as I imagine it, she's tended to all the physical elements, almost to a fault. And yet, there is one thing still full of need in her. The busyness of her doing has not satisfied that something, because it's a something beyond the physical. Now, I see Martha alone in her busyness, alone in the kitchen, working feverishly while Mary and Jesus and the disciples are gathered in community in the center room. Martha, for me, is a symbol of many things. We see in her the one who has isolated himself from community because of busyness. She's the one who doggedly pursues impossible standards instead of letting go of details and outcomes. She's the one who requires that others meet their needs and their standards and their expectations. She's the symbol of service out of obligation and duty. I've seen that so many times in children of aging parents. Service out of obligation, duty, and eventually resentment. Performance that's based on social expectations rather than sacred action that comes from an inner leading. She could have said, there are 15 of us, let's cook dinner together. But social standards said, the women cook. Mary's role isn't insignificant either. She represents the human condition in that, for me, she's the symbol of being present and waiting on guidance before we take action. And maybe that's to a fault too, that waiting on guidance that we never hear, so we never take action. She risks social rejection, if you think about it. She dares to be accepted for who she is, the woman who isn't cooking, the woman who is sitting among a group of men in her culture, listening for wisdom. She has single-minded focus that has eliminated the distraction of the banging pots in the kitchen. Mary embodies active listening that truly absorbs what the other is saying. She replenishes her soul by taking time for reflection and contemplation despite the list of things to do. Mary and Martha together are symbols of that tension between our human need for and perhaps our addiction to busyness, to doing, and our soul's need, our spirit's need for just being. We can't have one without the other. None of us, I don't think, are all Mary or all Martha. The challenge for us is in figuring out how to balance being and doing. I liken it to the kind of tension between the threads on a sewing machine. And if you're not familiar with it, the spool, ironically, is on the outside. It feeds the thread to the needle from the top down. The bobbin is on the inside, and it feeds the thread to the needle from the bottom up. If the tension between the two threads, top and bottom, is too loose, then the underside of the fabric gets totally snarled with just bunches of thread all tangled up. And the fabric will pull apart really easily from the moment it's stressed. But if the threads are too tight, they'll snap from too much tension. There has to be a proper balance between the two spools and the bobbin if the fabric is to hold correctly. It's easy to adjust that tension knob on a sewing machine, but it's not easy to achieve a balance between being and doing in our lives. Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh called this balance engaged mindfulness, busy and being, pardon me. He tells the story of the Vietnam War coming to the very doorstep of a Buddhist monastery where they had taken a vow to live inside in prayer and contemplation and shut out the outside world. When they could no longer ignore it, they debated on whether to leave their contemplation and their prayers and their vows, and to help those who were suffering from the wounds of war, or to stay put and honor those vows. The monks elected to do both. They decided to help the people while maintaining their single-minded awareness and focus on the present moment and the sacred wisdom that each moment contains. By staying mindful and engaged, they were able to be as peace-filled out in the world as they were when they sat in contemplation. And I imagine the early Quakers on the New Garden battlefield pulling off the dead and the wounded, doing that exact same thing. Part of mindful engagement requires that we do only one thing at a time. But how often do you find yourself reading a book or scrolling online, and you're eating supper and you're listening to someone talk, maybe the TV's on, or you're driving your car and you're listening to the radio and talking on your cell phone and maybe saying something to the people beside you in the next car. We're just conditioned to do your multitasking. I have a friend whose 5-year-old was on the toilet one time and was reading a book, and she said, "Look, Mom, I'm multitasking." But it'll actually surprise you that when you begin to focus on doing one thing at a time, and it took me over a year to break the habit of multitasking, your day and your nerves will be much more relaxed. In fact, there are studies that have shown that you will have more time and attention to complete a single task when you're doing only one thing instead of trying to do several things at a time. It takes 20 minutes, according to one study, to totally turn your focus to one thing. So if you're multitasking, you're not doing anything well. Single-minded focus can keep us from being anxious and troubled about many things. Thich Nhat Hanh also suggests that by taking time to breathe consciously and slowly, we can nourish our awareness in each moment. In fact, I was just listening to a podcast on my way over here by a woman who wrote a book called Body by Breath. And she talks about studies that have shown that breathing doesn't just have a body-wide effect, it has a body-mind effect. As we slow down to breathe and focus on one task at hand, the distractions are, in our heads at least, are diminished. The peace of the simple beingness that we feel when we're in contemplative silence has room to accompany us in our doing. Our busy thinking and busy doing doesn't chase it to the edges of our spirit. Every action that we take becomes an extension of the richness that we find in these quiet moments. In fact, I think that a British friend, Gordon Matthews from Britain Faith and Practice, says it best. We need a deeper spirituality and a more outspoken witness. If our spirituality can reach down into the depths of authentic prayer, our lives will become an authentic witness for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, a witness that becomes the context for our prayer. So it's like yin and yang. Out of the depths of authentic prayer comes a longing for peace and a passion for justice. And our response to violence and injustice is to pray more deeply, because only God can show us the way out of the mess that the world is in. And only God can give us the strength to follow that way. We're all maybe sorely conscious of the work that remains to be done in our private lives, in our country, in our world. And the first work to be done is the one thing that is needful. When we begin with that, as we regularly practice being in the present moment and breathing through a mindfulness, that's the Mary in us. And then take that mindfulness and calm breath into everything we do, the Martha in us. Mindfulness through conscious breathing, single-minded focus, and perhaps that deep, authentic prayer from within can penetrate the activities of our daily lives and bring it into balance of being and doing. And so it is. Amen.